The laughter started before Nora even reached the top of the stairs. She stopped mid-step, her hand tight on the cold iron railing, and felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward her at once. The chandeliers above burned too bright, throwing hard light on the pale blue dress she had sewn herself late into the night, stitch by careful stitch, hoping it would be enough to let her blend in for just one evening. It was not enough. Edmund Hale stood near the center of the room, a glass of dark wine in his hand, his smile already curling with cruelty before he even opened his mouth. He raised his voice just enough for the room to catch every word. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence," he said. "The pig farmer's daughter, dressed up like she belongs here." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Some people covered their mouths politely. Others did not bother hiding their amusement at all. Nora felt her face grow hot, her pulse pounding hard enough that she could hear it in her own ears. She did not run. She wanted to. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around, walk back down those stairs, and disappear into the night where no one could see her humiliation. But she had promised her mother she would come. She had promised herself she would not let people like Edmund decide who she was allowed to be. So instead, she lifted her chin and stepped fully into the room. "Good evening, Edmund," she said, her voice steady, even though her hands trembled at her sides. "I did not realize good manners were only for people with money." A few people near the punch table let out surprised laughs of their own, quickly disguised as coughs. Edmund's smile faltered for half a second before he recovered it. Sharper now. "Careful," he said. "Someone might mistake you for having wit instead of hay in your hair." Caroline Hale, his mother, stood just behind him, in a gown that probably cost more than Nora's family made from an entire season of farming. She watched the exchange with the faint, satisfied expression of a woman who enjoyed seeing others put in their place. She did not laugh, but her silence was its own kind of cruelty, a quiet approval that told everyone in the room exactly whose side they should be on. Nora scanned the crowd. She recognized almost every face. The banker's daughter who used to sit 2 seats behind her in school and never once said a kind word. The mayor's son who had once thrown mud at her boots and called it an accident. The women from the church charity board who smiled to her mother's face and whispered behind her back the moment she turned away. None of them said anything to defend her. None of them needed to. They had already decided long ago that Nora Bennett did not belong among them, no matter how politely she spoke or how carefully she dressed. To them, she would always be the girl who smelled faintly of the barn no matter how many times she washed, the girl whose family raised pigs instead of owning banks, the girl who was allowed into their world only as entertainment. She refused to let it show on her face, though inside, something in her chest cracked like thin ice under too much weight. "If you will excuse me," she said, keeping her voice level, "I believe I have had enough entertainment for one evening." She turned before anyone could respond, and walked back toward the stairs with her spine straight and her steps unhurried, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her run. Behind her, she heard Edmund mutter something to his friends, followed by another burst of laughter. She did not turn around to see what it was. She did not need to. She already knew the shape of it, the same shape it had taken her entire life. She was the punchline. She always had been. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold against her flushed skin. She stood at the bottom of the grand stone steps for a long moment, breathing hard, staring up at the glowing windows of the mansion where the party continued without her, as if she had never been there at all. A carriage waited nearby, though it was not the fine kind the other guests arrived in. It belonged to a neighbor who had offered her a ride, an old wooden cart pulled by a single tired horse. She climbed in without waiting for help, arranging her dress carefully so it would not catch on the splintered wood. The ride home was long and quiet. Fields stretched out on either side of the road, dark and endless under a sky full of stars that did not care one bit about the humiliation she had just survived. She watched them pass, thinking of nothing and everything at once. By the time she reached the farm, the lanterns in the house were still lit. Her mother, Grace Bennett, was waiting at the door, an old shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face lined with the kind of worry only a mother could carry.
"You are back early,"
Grace said, though her tone made it clear she already suspected why. Nora did not answer right away. She stepped past her mother into the warm kitchen, the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs familiar and grounding after the perfume and wine of the ballroom. She sat down at the worn wooden table, and finally let her shoulders drop. "They laughed at me again," she said quietly. "Edmund Hale called me the pig farmer's daughter in front of everyone." Grace sat across from her, reaching out to take her daughter's hand. Her palm was rough from years of hard work, but her touch was gentle. "Let them laugh," Grace said. "Laughter is cheap." It costs them nothing and changes nothing. You know who you are, Nora. That is worth more than every gown in that ballroom. It does not feel that way, Nora admitted. It feels like no matter what I do, no matter how hard I work or how well I speak, they will always see me as less than them. Grace squeezed her hand. Then you will simply have to show them otherwise. Not through anger, through results. People like the Hales only understand one language, and it is not kindness, it is power. Nora sat with that thought long after her mother had gone to bed. The house grew quiet except for the soft creak of settling wood, and the distant sound of pigs shifting in their pens outside. She thought about Edmund's smile, about Caroline's silent approval, about the banker's daughter who would not meet her eyes. She thought about the years of small cruelties that had led to this one, each unkind word stacking on top of the last until they formed a wall she had spent her whole life trying to climb. For the first time, though, she did not feel like climbing that wall anymore. She felt like tearing it down. The next morning, she rose before dawn, as she always did, pulling on her worn boots and heading out to the barn to begin the chores that never seemed to end. The pigs greeted her with their usual noise, snorting and shuffling as she filled their troughs. She worked in silence, her mind far from the farm, replaying the events of the night before, searching every detail for something useful. It was while she was mucking out the far pen that she noticed her father, Walter, standing by the fence, watching her with a thoughtful expression. "You are working harder than usual this morning," he said. "I am thinking," Nora replied, not looking up from her work. "About what happened at the gala." She paused, resting her arms on the handle of the shovel. "About what happens next," she said. "I am tired of being something people laugh at. I want to be something they cannot ignore." Her father studied her for a long moment. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his daughter always listened. "Your grandfather started this farm with nothing but 2 pigs and a stubborn refusal to quit," he said. "People laughed at him too, in the beginning. He never let it stop him. Whatever you decide to do, Nora, do it because it is right for you, not because you want to prove something to people who were never worth your time in the first place." Nora nodded slowly, though privately she knew it was already too late for that advice. She did want to prove something. She wanted the Hales, and everyone who had laughed alongside them, to understand exactly how wrong they had been about her. She just did not yet know how. Later that afternoon, while delivering eggs and fresh produce to the small market in town, she overheard 2 women speaking near the fabric stall. Their voices were low, meant only for each other, but the wind carried their words clearly enough. "Victor Hale's shipping company is struggling," one woman whispered. "My husband works with the bank. He said they missed another payment last month." "Surely not," the other replied. "The Hales have always been the wealthiest family in the county." "Old money does not last forever if no one is managing it properly," the first woman said. "Victor has been too busy with his social calendar to notice his own company crumbling beneath him." Nora kept walking, her basket of eggs balanced carefully on her hip, but her mind was racing. The Hales, so proud, so certain of their place at the top of everyone else's world, were quietly falling apart behind their polished doors and expensive parties. It was the smallest crack in their armor, but a crack was still a crack. And Nora Bennett had spent her entire life learning how to notice the smallest details other people overlooked, whether it was a sick animal hiding its pain, or a storm building on the horizon long before anyone else saw the clouds. She tucked the information away carefully, like a seed planted deep in dark soil, waiting for the right season to grow. That evening, as she walked home along the familiar dirt road, she passed a well-dressed stranger standing beside a stalled carriage, examining one of its wheels with visible frustration. He looked out of place among the quiet farmland, his coat too fine for the dust of the road. "Trouble?" she asked, slowing her steps. The man looked up, surprised. "The wheel has come loose," he said. "I'm afraid I know very little about carriages." Nora set down her basket without hesitation and knelt beside the wheel, examining the joint with practiced eyes. Growing up on a farm meant knowing how to fix nearly everything with her own 2 hands, from broken fences to stubborn machinery. "It is not serious," she said. "The pin has slipped. Give me a moment." Within a few minutes, she had the wheel secured properly, wiping her hands on her apron as she stood. The stranger watched her with something like astonishment. "That was remarkably efficient," he said. "Most people in fine clothes would not know where to begin." "I am not most people in fine clothes," Nora said simply, glancing down at her plain, dust-covered dress. "I am a farmer's daughter. We learn to fix things because we cannot always afford to replace them." The man studied her with new interest. "I am Daniel Pierce," he said, extending a hand. I run a trading company 2 counties over. I was passing through on business when this happened. Nora Bennett, she replied, shaking his hand firmly. Something in the way he looked at her felt different from the way the people at the gala had looked at her the night before. There was no mockery in his expression, no hidden judgment waiting behind polite words, just simple, genuine curiosity. Well, Nora Bennett, Daniel said, I owe you a debt of gratitude. If you are ever looking for work that makes better use of talents like yours, my company is always looking for people who can solve problems quickly and think clearly under pressure. Nora almost laughed at the idea. Work outside the farm, away from the pigs and the mud and the endless chores, in a world of trade and business she knew nothing about, felt as distant and unreachable as the stars she had stared at the night before. But something about his offer lodged itself in her mind, refusing to be dismissed. I will consider it, she said. Please do, Daniel replied, climbing back into his repaired carriage. The offer stands whenever you are ready. She watched him ride away until the carriage disappeared around the bend, dust settling slowly behind it. Then she picked up her basket and continued walking home, her thoughts spinning faster than they had all day. By the time she reached her front door, the humiliation of the ballroom felt further away than it had that morning. In its place sat something new, something sharper and more purposeful. She thought of Edmund's cruel smile. She thought of Caroline's silent approval. She thought of Victor Hale's quietly failing business, and of Daniel Pierce's genuine offer of opportunity. For the first time in a very long while, Nora Bennett went to bed not with the ache of humiliation weighing on her chest, but with the quiet, steady beginning of a plan. She did not yet know exactly what shape her revenge would take, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that it was coming. The carriage was already waiting at the crossroads when Nora arrived, 2 weeks after the night that had changed everything. She had not written to Daniel Pierce right away. For several days after their meeting, she told herself the offer had been nothing more than politeness, the kind of thing wealthy men said to strangers who helped them without expecting anything in return. But the thought would not leave her alone. It followed her through the barn chores, through the long hours at the market, through the quiet evenings when her mother hummed old songs while mending torn clothes by candlelight. Finally, on a morning when frost still clung to the fence posts, Nora had written a short letter and sent it into town with the milk delivery. 3 days later, a reply came back in careful handwriting, inviting her to meet at the crossroads the following week to discuss a position at his company. Now she stood there, her one good coat buttoned tightly against the cold, a small bag containing a change of clothes and a few coins resting at her feet. She had told her parents everything, and though her mother's eyes had filled with worry, she had also seen something like pride hidden underneath it. You have always been meant for more than this farm, Grace had told her the night before. Go and prove it. Just do not forget where you came from. I never could, Nora had replied. It made me who I am. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of her, and Daniel stepped down, offering a polite nod, instead of the exaggerated greetings she had grown used to from people trying to impress or belittle her. I was not certain you would come, he admitted. Neither was I, Nora said honestly, but I decided I would rather regret trying than regret never knowing. He smiled at that, gesturing for her to climb aboard. A sensible philosophy. I think you will do well in trade. The ride to his company headquarters took most of the day, winding through towns Nora had never seen before, past markets far larger than her own, filled with goods from places she could only imagine. By the time they arrived, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red over a bustling harbor town filled with ships and warehouses. Daniel's company occupied a large stone building near the docks, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Inside, the air smelled of ink, parchment, and the faint salt of the nearby sea. Men in fine coats moved briskly between rooms, carrying ledgers and crates, their voices low and focused. This is where the real work happens, Daniel explained, leading her through the halls. We trade in grain, textiles, livestock, and increasingly, agricultural equipment. It is complicated work, but I believe someone with your background could bring a perspective we currently lack. Nora tried not to let her nervousness show as they entered a large office lined with shelves of ledgers and maps. A stern-looking woman sat behind a desk near the window, her sharp eyes flicking up at their entrance. This is Nora Bennett, Daniel said. She will be joining us starting tomorrow, working alongside our agricultural trade division. The woman studied Nora for a long moment, taking in her plain dress and work-worn hands with an expression Nora could not quite read. A farmer's daughter in the trade office, the woman said slowly. That is certainly unusual. Unusual is not the same as wrong, Daniel replied evenly. Give her a chance before you judge her, Margaret. Margaret's expression did not soften completely, but she gave a small nod. Very well. We will see what she can offer. Nora felt the familiar sting of being underestimated, but this time, instead of shrinking beneath it, something steady settled into her chest. She had faced far worse than a skeptical office manager. She had faced an entire ballroom of people who believed she did not belong among them, and she had walked out with her head held high. This was simply one more room to prove herself in. The following morning, she began her work in the agricultural division, a small, cluttered office filled with reports on grain shipments, livestock prices, and seasonal trade patterns. The two men working alongside her, a quiet clerk named Edwin and an older accountant named Harold, seemed unsure what to make of her presence at first, offering polite but distant greetings. It did not take long for Nora to prove her worth. Within her first week, she noticed something the others had overlooked entirely. A shipment of grain from a neighboring county had been delayed repeatedly, causing losses each time it arrived spoiled or underweight. The official reports blamed poor weather and unreliable roads, but Nora, having spent her entire life around farming, recognized the pattern immediately. The grain is not spoiling from the weather, she told Harold, spreading the shipping records across the desk between them. Look at the timing. Every delayed shipment comes from farms along the eastern route, always during the same week of the month. Harold frowned, adjusting his spectacles as he studied the papers. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting the farmers along that route are prioritizing their local market days over our shipping schedule, Nora explained. They sell their freshest grain locally first, then send us whatever remains after their own market closes. By the time it reaches us, it has already been sitting too long. Harold looked up at her, surprised. How could you possibly know that from a shipping ledger? Because I have stood at those same market stalls, Nora said. I know how farmers think. We protect our own communities first. It is not carelessness. It is priority. When Daniel heard of her discovery, he called her into his office personally, listening intently as she explained her theory in full detail. If you are right, he said slowly, this could save the company a significant amount of money. What would you suggest we do about it? Nora had already thought through the solution during the sleepless hours of the night before. Adjust the shipping schedule to align with their local market days instead of competing against them. If we collect the grain immediately after their markets close, we get the freshest possible product, and the farmers get to serve their communities first without losing our business entirely. Daniel studied her for a long moment, something like genuine admiration flickering across his face. That is remarkably clever, Nora. I will bring this to the board immediately. Within a month, the new shipping schedule was implemented, and losses from spoiled grain dropped dramatically. Word of Nora's contribution spread quietly through the company, earning her cautious respect from colleagues who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a farmer playing at business. Margaret, in particular, began seeking her out for advice on other agricultural matters, her initial skepticism slowly giving way to something resembling professional trust. I underestimated you, Margaret admitted one afternoon, several weeks into Nora's employment. I assumed a farmer's daughter would know nothing beyond planting and harvesting. I was wrong. Most people assume that, Nora replied without bitterness. I have grown used to proving them wrong. In those early months at the trading company, Nora also began learning the quieter rules of the world she had entered, rules no one wrote down but everyone seemed to understand. She noticed how the senior partners addressed each other in meetings, how contracts were phrased to sound generous while protecting the interests of whoever held the pen. She began staying an extra hour each evening simply to read old agreements Daniel kept filed away, teaching herself the language of business, the same patient way she had once taught herself to read weather, in the shape of clouds over the farm. Edwin, the quiet clerk who had barely spoken to her during her first weeks, gradually warmed to her presence once he realized she never dismissed his opinions the way some of the more senior staff did. He began bringing her difficult shipping puzzles before taking them to anyone else, trusting her instincts over his own uncertainty. You see patterns the rest of us miss, he told her one afternoon, watching her untangle a scheduling conflict that had confused the office for nearly a week. It is like you already know what the numbers are going to say before you look at them. I spent my whole life watching for patterns, Nora replied. A sick animal shows signs long before it falls ill. A storm shows itself in the wind long before the rain arrives. Numbers are no different, once you learn to read them the same way. Word of her steady rise reached beyond the walls of the trading company as well. Merchants who visited the harbor began asking specifically for her by name when negotiating agricultural contracts. Having heard through quiet channels that the young woman in the agricultural division negotiated fairly, and never wasted anyone's time with empty promises. Her reputation, built entirely on results rather than connections, grew slowly but steadily, each success adding another brick to the foundation she was constructing beneath herself. Meanwhile, far from the busy harbor town, word of Nora's departure had reached the ears of the Hale family, carried through the same gossiping circles that had once mocked her at the gala. Caroline Hale, upon hearing that the pig farmer's daughter had somehow secured a position with a respected trading company, dismissed the news with a scornful laugh. "A farm girl playing at business," she told her son over dinner one evening. "It will not last. People like her always return to where they belong eventually." Edmund, distracted by his own concerns, barely acknowledged the comment. His father's shipping company, once the pride of the family fortune, had continued its quiet decline, though neither Edmund nor Caroline fully understood the severity of the situation. Victor Hale kept the details carefully hidden, unwilling to admit even to his own family how close they had come to serious financial trouble. He attended meetings with increasing anxiety, his usual confidence replaced by a tight, controlled desperation as he searched for new trade partnerships to keep his failing company afloat. None of the deals he pursued seemed to materialize, each potential partner backing away after reviewing his company's unstable finances. What Victor did not know, and what Nora was only beginning to discover through her growing knowledge of the trade industry, was that many of those same struggling partnerships ran directly through companies like Daniel Pierce's, companies that controlled access to reliable shipping routes and steady agricultural supply chains across the region. The threads of the story, though neither side yet realized it, had already begun quietly weaving themselves together. Back at the trading company, Nora continued proving herself with each passing week, tackling problems with a combination of practical farm knowledge and sharp analytical thinking that impressed even the most skeptical of her colleagues. She worked longer hours than anyone expected, staying late to study shipping manifests and trade agreements, determined to understand every aspect of the business that had given her this unexpected chance. Daniel began including her in larger meetings, introducing her to important clients and trade partners as a rising talent within the agricultural division. Though some still eyed her plain background with quiet judgment, her results spoke louder than any prejudice they carried. One evening, as she reviewed a stack of regional trade reports long after most of the office had emptied for the night, Daniel found her still working by lamplight, a cup of cold tea forgotten beside her papers. "You work harder than anyone else in this building," he said, leaning against the doorway. "I have something to prove," Nora replied without looking up. "To whom?" She finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "To everyone who ever believed I did not deserve to be in a room like this one." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind his expression. "You already have," he said quietly, "whether they choose to see it or not." Nora allowed herself a small, tired smile, though privately, she knew proving herself to Daniel and his company was only the beginning. The real reckoning she sought waited far beyond these office walls, in a grand house filled with cruel laughter and cold judgment, where a family's fortune was quietly crumbling without their full knowledge. She was patient. She had learned patience from years of tending crops that took entire seasons to grow, from raising animals that could not be rushed no matter how much she wished it. She understood, better than most, that true revenge was not born from a single dramatic moment. It was built slowly, carefully, one solid brick at a time, until the structure became too strong to ever be knocked down again. As the weeks turned into months, Nora's reputation within the company continued to grow, her name becoming synonymous with clever solutions and steady reliability. She had not forgotten Edmund's cruel words, nor Caroline's silent approval of his mockery. She carried them with her still, tucked away deep inside, not as an open wound anymore, but as fuel for the careful, deliberate plan slowly taking shape in her mind. Somewhere, not far away, the Hale family's fortune continued its quiet collapse, unaware that the very girl they had humiliated now stood closer to their downfall than any of them could possibly imagine. A full year had passed since Nora first walked through the doors of Daniel Pierce's trading company, and the girl who once stood trembling on a ballroom staircase had become someone else entirely, though her heart remained exactly the same underneath the new confidence she wore like armor. She now oversaw the entire agricultural division, a position no one, least of all Nora herself, had imagined possible when she first arrived with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn determination. Margaret, who had once questioned whether a farmer's daughter belonged in the trade office at all, now worked directly under her guidance, their earlier tension replaced by genuine mutual respect. The company's fortunes had grown considerably under her influence, expanding trade routes and securing partnerships that others had once thought impossible. Word of her success had begun spreading beyond the harbor town, reaching merchants and traders in neighboring counties who spoke of the sharp-minded woman who had transformed a struggling agricultural division into one of the company's most profitable branches. It was during a routine review of potential new partnerships that Nora first encountered documents bearing a name she recognized instantly: Hale Shipping Company. Her hands stilled over the papers, memories of that humiliating night flooding back with startling clarity. She forced herself to breathe steadily, setting aside the sudden surge of emotion in favor of careful, analytical focus. This was business now, not personal history. She needed to approach it as she would any other opportunity. The documents told a troubling story. Victor Hale's once prestigious shipping company had accumulated significant debt over the past several years, its once reliable trade routes falling into disrepair as competitors offered faster, more efficient service. Several major clients had already abandoned their partnerships with the Hales, seeking more stable options elsewhere. Nora spent the following days quietly gathering every piece of information available about the company's financial situation, cross-referencing shipping records, market reports, and public trade agreements. What she uncovered painted an increasingly clear picture. The Hale family, so proud and untouchable at their grand ballroom gala, stood on the edge of complete financial collapse. Before approaching Daniel with what she had found, Nora spent several long nights alone in the trading company's archive room, sorting through years of correspondence between the Hale Shipping Company and various trade partners. She read letters filled with growing desperation disguised as polite business language, watched contracts shrink in value year after year as reliable partners quietly withdrew, and noted the increasingly frequent late payments buried within otherwise ordinary shipping records. She also studied the men and companies who had already abandoned partnerships with the Hales, trying to understand exactly what had driven each decision. A grain merchant from the northern counties had ended his contract after 2 shipments arrived damaged beyond use. A textile trader had grown tired of delayed payments that stretched well beyond agreed terms. Each departure told its own small story, and together they painted a picture of a company slowly drowning under the weight of its own mismanagement, propped up for years only by the family name attached to it. It struck her, during those quiet hours surrounded by ledgers and lamplight, how differently the world treated failure depending on who was failing. Her own family had scraped by through difficult seasons using nothing but hard work and careful planning, never once receiving the benefit of assumed competence simply because of a respected surname. The Hales, by contrast, had been permitted years of decline before anyone dared question their judgment openly. She did not allow the thought to harden into bitterness. Instead, she folded it carefully into her growing understanding of exactly how such fragile empires could be approached, and exactly how much leverage patient, careful preparation could provide to someone willing to do the work others overlooked. By the time she felt confident enough in her research, she had compiled a thorough, undeniable picture of the Hale family's true financial position, more complete than anything Victor Hale himself had likely allowed himself to fully examine. She brought her findings to Daniel's office late one afternoon, laying out the documents carefully across his desk. "The Hale Shipping Company is failing," she said without preamble. "Their debts have grown far beyond what their remaining assets can cover. Within the year, unless something changes dramatically, they will lose everything." Daniel studied the papers with growing interest. "You have done thorough research," he said. "What exactly are you proposing?" Nora hesitated only briefly before answering. "I believe our company should approach them about a trade partnership. Their shipping routes, despite their financial troubles, still hold significant strategic value along the eastern coast. If we can negotiate favorable terms while they are desperate for stability, we stand to gain considerably." Daniel raised an eyebrow, studying her carefully. "This is the same family that humiliated you at that gala, is it not?" Nora met his gaze steadily. "It is. And you are suggesting we help save their company?" "I am suggesting we position ourselves to control it," Nora corrected. "There is a significant difference between charity and strategy. If we approach this correctly, we do not simply rescue the Hales from their own mistakes. We become essential to their survival, on our terms, not theirs." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with something between admiration and quiet caution. "That is a rather calculated approach for someone with personal history involved." "Personal history is exactly why I understand the value of patience," Nora replied. "I am not interested in petty satisfaction. I am interested in real power. There is a difference, and I intend to claim the second." Over the following weeks, Nora worked tirelessly to build the framework for a potential partnership, studying every aspect of the shipping industry to ensure she understood exactly how to structure a deal that would benefit her company while placing the Hales in a position of genuine dependence. She met with trade lawyers, studied contract law late into the night, and consulted with experienced negotiators to refine her approach. Throughout it all, she kept her personal connection to the Hale family carefully hidden, allowing Daniel to initiate preliminary conversations under the company's name alone, without revealing which specific member of his staff had proposed the arrangement. Victor Hale, increasingly desperate as his company's situation worsened, welcomed the initial contact from Daniel Pierce's trading company with poorly disguised relief. Reports from those early meetings, relayed back to Nora through Daniel, described a man far removed from the confident aristocrat who had once ruled over county society, without a second thought. He seemed almost grateful, Daniel told her after their first formal discussion. I do not think he fully understands how precarious his position has become. He still speaks as though this partnership would simply be an addition to his existing success, rather than the lifeline it truly represents. He will understand eventually, Nora said quietly. Everyone does, eventually. As negotiations progressed, Nora immersed herself completely in the details, drafting proposals that appeared generous on the surface, while quietly ensuring her company would gain significant control over the most valuable aspects of the Hale shipping routes. She structured payment terms that seemed reasonable to a desperate man but would ultimately shift financial power decisively in her company's favor, should the Hales ever default on their obligations. It was careful, meticulous work, the kind that required patience and precision, rather than dramatic confrontation. She thought often of her mother's words from that first night after the gala. People like the Hales only understand one language, and it is not kindness, it is power. Nora intended to speak that language fluently. Meanwhile, within the Hale household, tensions simmered beneath the surface of maintained appearances. Victor grew increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours locked away in his study, poring over documents with an intensity that worried even Caroline, though she remained largely unaware of the true severity of their financial troubles. Edmund, still oblivious to the true state of his family's fortune, continued his usual pursuits, attending social gatherings and maintaining the appearance of untouchable wealth, even as the foundation beneath his lifestyle grew increasingly unstable. He had grown restless in recent months, his engagement to a suitable young woman from another prominent family having recently ended after her father grew suspicious of rumors surrounding the Hale family's financial stability. It is nothing more than jealous gossip, Caroline assured her son repeatedly, though her own confidence had begun to waver in private moments when she believed no one was watching. The gala that had once represented the pinnacle of the Hale family's social standing now felt like a distant memory, its glittering excess a stark contrast to the quiet anxiety now settling over their grand estate. Back at the trading company, Nora's careful planning continued to take shape. She spent long evenings reviewing contract details with Daniel, refining every clause to ensure maximum advantage while maintaining enough apparent generosity to keep Victor Hale eager to finalize the agreement. You have thought of everything, Daniel remarked one evening, reviewing the latest draft of the partnership agreement. I have negotiated countless deals in my career, and I have rarely seen anyone approach a contract with this level of precision. I learned precision from raising animals that could die from a single mistake, Nora replied. Business is not so different. One overlooked detail can destroy everything you have built. She spent an entire week refining the payment structure alone, testing different arrangements against every possible scenario she could imagine, from steady recovery to continued decline. She wanted the agreement to hold firm regardless of which direction the Hale family's fortunes eventually turned, protecting her company's interests without appearing predatory to outside observers who might later review the terms. Margaret helped where she could, offering insight into how similar agreements had played out for other struggling companies across the region. The mistake most people make, Margaret told her one evening, is trying to win everything in a single agreement. The strongest deals leave enough room for both sides to survive comfortably, while still ensuring one side holds the true advantage should things go wrong. Nora took the advice seriously, adjusting several clauses to appear more generous on the surface, while carefully preserving the underlying structure that would keep her company protected. She wanted Victor Hale to feel relieved when he read the terms, not cornered, understanding instinctively that a desperate man who felt trapped might make reckless decisions, while a desperate man who felt grateful would cooperate fully. Harold, reviewing the final numbers before they were sent forward, let out a low whistle of admiration. I have worked in this office for 11 years, he said. I have never seen a contract this carefully balanced. You have left them just enough hope to sign willingly. and just enough exposure to ensure we hold the true power should anything change. That is precisely the intention, Nora replied. As the final stages of negotiation approached, Nora made a decision that surprised even herself. Rather than allowing her identity to remain hidden until the contract was fully signed, she chose to reveal herself personally at the formal dinner where the partnership would be finalized. "Are you certain?" Daniel asked when she informed him of her decision. "You could simply let the deal proceed without ever confronting them directly." "I could," Nora agreed. "But I did not spend the last year building this position simply to hide from the people who once believed I did not deserve a seat at their table. I want them to see exactly who has been standing behind this partnership all along." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something like quiet respect settling into his expression. "Then we will make certain your entrance is unforgettable." As the date of the formal dinner approached, Nora found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The trembling girl who had once fled a ballroom in humiliation felt like a distant memory now, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth far too clearly to ever again let someone else's cruelty define her. She thought of her father's words about her grandfather, a man who had built something lasting from nothing, despite every voice that told him he could not. She thought of her mother's quiet strength, the years of enduring whispered judgment with dignity and tact. She thought of Daniel's genuine faith in her abilities, offered without condition or hidden motive, simply because he had recognized her worth from the very beginning. And she thought of Edmund's cruel smile, of Caroline's silent approval, of an entire ballroom of people who had laughed without a single thought for the girl standing humiliated before them. Soon, they would all understand exactly how wrong they had been. The night of the formal dinner arrived with a quiet, steady certainty that settled over Nora like armor as she dressed carefully in her private quarters at the trading company. Unlike the modest dress she had worn to that first humiliating gala, this gown had been carefully chosen, elegant but understated, a reflection of the confident, capable woman she had become, rather than an attempt to impress anyone who might judge her. She studied her reflection in the mirror for a long moment, hardly recognizing the composed, steady-eyed woman staring back at her. The girl who had once fled in humiliation was still there somewhere, but she had grown into someone far stronger, someone who no longer needed anyone else's approval to know her own value. Margaret arrived at her quarters just before she was set to leave, carrying a small wrapped parcel that turned out to be a pair of simple pearl earrings, worn and slightly old-fashioned but clearly cherished. "They were my mother's," Margaret said, pressing them gently into Nora's palm. "She came from very little as well, before she married into slightly better circumstances. She always told me that dignity does not come from what you wear, but she also said there is no harm in wearing something meaningful when you need extra courage. I want you to have them tonight." Nora accepted the small gift with genuine emotion, fastening the earrings carefully before studying her reflection once more. They did not glitter the way the jewelry worn by women like Caroline Hale would glitter, but they carried something far more valuable, the quiet strength of another woman who had once stood exactly where Nora now stood, uncertain but determined. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will remember this." "Go show them exactly who you have become," Margaret said, squeezing her hand before stepping back. "You have earned every bit of this evening." Daniel waited for her downstairs, dressed formally for the occasion, his expression calm, but clearly aware of the significance the night carried. He did not rush her, allowing her the final quiet moments she needed to settle her nerves before they departed. "Whatever happens tonight," he said as they climbed into the carriage, "you have already proven everything you set out to prove. Tonight simply makes it visible to the people who once refused to see it." Nora nodded, watching the familiar countryside pass by the carriage window. The same roads she had once traveled home in humiliation, now carrying her towards something entirely different. She thought of her mother's steady hands, her father's quiet pride, and the year of relentless work that had brought her to this exact moment. Tonight, the Hale family would learn that lesson as well. The private dining hall glowed with warm candlelight when Nora arrived, exactly on schedule, her steps measured and calm despite the storm of anticipation building beneath her composed exterior. Daniel walked beside her, offering a reassuring glance as they approached the heavy wooden doors. "Once we enter, there is no turning back," he said quietly. "Are you certain this is how you want to proceed?" "I have never been more certain of anything," Nora replied. The doors opened, revealing a long table set with fine china and gleaming silver, the kind of luxury Nora had once only glimpsed from the outside of grand houses she was never invited into. Victor Hale sat near the head of the table, his expression tight with barely concealed anxiety, while Caroline sat beside him, still maintaining the practiced elegance that had defined her entire life. Edmund occupied a chair further down, looking bored and distracted, clearly unaware of the true significance of this particular business dinner. A servant moved quietly along the edges of the room, filling glasses with dark wine and setting the final dishes before the gathered guests. The room smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, warm and inviting in a way that felt almost cruel given the tension gathering silently beneath the surface of the evening. Candlelight flickered against polished silver, throwing long shadows across the walls where portraits of past generations of Hales looked down upon the table with painted, unmoving expressions. Victor kept glancing toward the door, checking his pocket watch with barely concealed impatience, clearly anxious for the meeting that would determine his family's future to finally begin. Caroline maintained her composed exterior, though the tight set of her shoulders betrayed a nervousness she would never openly admit. Edmund swirled his wine glass absently, engaged in idle conversation with no real interest in the business at hand, still believing this evening carried no greater significance than any other formal dinner his family had hosted throughout his life. None of them noticed Nora's entrance at first, their attention fixed on Daniel as he moved toward the table with the easy confidence of a man used to commanding respect in rooms exactly like this one. "Mr. Pierce," Victor said, rising from his seat with visible relief. "Thank you for agreeing to finalize the details in person. I trust this arrangement will prove beneficial for both our companies." "I certainly hope so," Daniel replied smoothly. "Though I should mention, the true architect behind this partnership deserves proper introduction." He stepped aside, allowing Nora to move fully into the candlelight. For a long moment, no one spoke. Victor's eyes widened slightly, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to place the composed, elegantly dressed woman standing before him. Caroline's expression shifted more slowly, recognition dawning gradually as memory connected the pieces together. It was Edmund who spoke first, his voice carrying the same careless arrogance Nora remembered so vividly from the gala. "Well," he said, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his face. "If it is not the pig farmer's daughter, dressed up again." Nora met his gaze without flinching, her voice calm and steady when she finally spoke. "Good evening, Edmund. It has been quite some time." Caroline's composure cracked visibly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wineglass. "I do not understand," she said slowly. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Daniel said, his tone remaining perfectly professional, "is that Nora Bennett has served as the lead architect of our agricultural and shipping partnerships for the past year. She personally identified the opportunity for this particular arrangement and has overseen every detail of its structure." Victor's face had gone noticeably pale, the full weight of the situation beginning to settle over him. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that the terms of this agreement, the terms that will determine the survival of my company, were designed by her?" "Precisely," Nora said, finally taking her seat at the table, with the same quiet confidence she had cultivated over the past year of careful, deliberate work. "I understand this may come as something of a surprise." Edmund's smile had faded entirely now, replaced by an expression somewhere between disbelief and dawning realization. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "A farm girl does not simply become an expert in trade negotiations." "And yet here I am," Nora replied evenly. "I would suggest we focus on the matter at hand rather than my background, given the circumstances your family currently faces." Victor leaned forward, his earlier relief replaced entirely by tense apprehension. "What exactly are the circumstances you believe we face?" Nora opened the folder she had brought with her, spreading the documents carefully across the table. "Your company has accumulated significant debt over the past several years. 3 of your largest clients have already ended their partnerships, and 2 more are actively seeking alternative shipping arrangements. Without immediate intervention, I estimate your company will face complete financial collapse within the next 8 months. The color drained further from Victor's face as he stared at the papers before him, each figure confirming what he had spent months desperately trying to hide even from himself. "How could you possibly know all of this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I have spent the last year building a career in exactly this industry," Nora replied. "I did not simply stumble into this position, Victor. I earned it, through work you and your family once dismissed as beneath consideration." Caroline's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely. "This is revenge," she said sharply. "You are punishing us for a single unfortunate comment made at a party." "A single comment," Nora repeated slowly, "made in front of an entire room of people, by a family who has spent years treating my own with casual cruelty, simply because we did not share your wealth or your name. I am not here for petty revenge, Caroline. I am here because I built something real, and it happens to intersect with your family's failures. That is simply how the world works. Edmund, finally recovering some of his usual bravado, leaned forward with a sneer. And what exactly do you intend to do with this information? Gloat? Humiliate us the way you believe we humiliated you? Nora held his gaze steadily. I intend to offer your family a partnership that could save your company from complete collapse. Whether you accept it with the dignity this situation requires, or whether you allow your pride to destroy everything your family has built, is entirely your decision. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling heavily over the table. Victor stared at the documents before him, his hands trembling slightly as the reality of his situation became impossible to deny any longer. What are the terms? He asked quietly. Nora slid the contract across the table toward him. Favorable enough to stabilize your company immediately. Structured carefully enough to ensure my company retains significant influence over the shipping routes that matter most. This is not charity, Victor. This is business, conducted exactly the way your family taught me it should be conducted, through strength rather than sentiment. Victor read through the document slowly, his expression shifting through several emotions, before finally settling into something resembling reluctant acceptance. These terms are fair, he admitted quietly. More fair than I likely deserve, given the circumstances. I am aware, Nora said simply. Caroline's eyes remained fixed on Nora with an expression that mixed disbelief with something almost resembling grudging respect, though her pride refused to allow her to voice it openly. Edmund, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence, the full weight of his family's dependence on the very woman he had once mocked finally settling over him with uncomfortable clarity. I have one additional condition, Nora said, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the table. Victor looked up warily. What condition? I want a public acknowledgement, Nora said. Not of my involvement in this specific deal, but of the fact that judgments based on background and wealth mean nothing when measured against genuine skill and character. Your family has significant social influence in this county. I want that influence used, at least once, to correct the kind of casual cruelty your family has practiced for years. Victor exchanged a long look with Caroline, whose jaw had tightened considerably, though she said nothing in protest. Finally, Victor nodded slowly. I believe that can be arranged. Edmund's expression had shifted into something Nora had never seen from him before, a flicker of genuine discomfort mixed with something that might have been the beginning of real reflection. I owe you an apology, he said quietly, the words clearly difficult for him to voice. What I said at that gala was cruel, and I said it without a single thought for how it might affect you. Nora studied him for a long moment before responding. Apologies matter little without genuine change behind them, Edmund. I will accept your words tonight, but I will judge your character based on your actions moving forward, not simply on what you say in this room. The dinner continued in a far more subdued atmosphere than it had begun, the balance of power in the room having shifted so completely that even Caroline's usual sharp confidence had softened considerably by the time the final details of the agreement were settled. As Nora prepared to leave later that evening, Victor approached her privately near the entrance hall. I want you to know, he said quietly, that I never personally shared my family's views regarding your background. I regret not saying something the night of the gala. Nora studied him carefully, searching for genuine sincerity behind his words. Regret means little without action behind it, she said, but I appreciate you saying so. Caroline lingered nearby, clearly having overheard the exchange, though she made no move to approach directly. Instead, she watched Nora with an expression that had shifted subtly over the course of the evening. The earlier hostility softened into something more complicated, part resentment, part reluctant recognition of a strength she had never expected to encounter in someone she had so easily dismissed. Edmund found Nora once more near the doorway as she gathered her coat, his earlier bravado entirely absent now. I do not expect you to believe me, he said quietly, but I intend to do better. Not because I am afraid of what your company might do to ours, but because tonight showed me exactly what kind of man I have become, and I did not like what I saw. Nora paused, studying him carefully for any trace of the cruelty she remembered so clearly. Then prove it, she said simply, not to me, to yourself. That is the only apology that will ever truly matter. He nodded slowly, something like genuine resolve settling behind his eyes for the first time since she had known him. She stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of the evening settling over her slowly, as Daniel joined her near the waiting carriage. You handled that with remarkable grace, he said. Many people would have taken far greater satisfaction in their humiliation tonight. I did take satisfaction, Nora admitted. But not from cruelty. I took satisfaction from proving, once and for all, that they were wrong about me from the very beginning. As the carriage pulled away from the Hale estate, Nora looked back one final time at the grand house that had once represented everything she believed she could never achieve. Tonight, that same house depended entirely on her continued goodwill for its survival. The transformation felt complete, and yet, as she settled back into her seat for the long ride home, she understood that true change required far more than a single dramatic confrontation. The real work, the work of building something lasting and meaningful, still remained ahead of her. But for the first time since that humiliating night on the ballroom staircase, Nora Bennett felt entirely, unmistakably free. In the weeks following the dinner, life at the trading company settled into a new rhythm, though the shadow of that evening lingered in quiet ways. Nora oversaw the early implementation of the partnership agreement, coordinating with Victor's staff to align shipping schedules and adjust routes according to the terms they had negotiated. The work was demanding, requiring careful attention to detail as two very different companies learned to move in concert with one another. But Nora found a quiet satisfaction in watching the arrangement take shape exactly as she had designed it. Daniel checked in with her regularly, though he largely allowed her to manage the relationship independently, trusting the judgment she had earned through months of careful, deliberate work. "You built this," he told her one afternoon, reviewing the early results of the partnership. "I am simply here to make certain the company supports whatever you decide is necessary." Word of the arrangement spread slowly through business circles, carried along the same channels of gossip that had once spread news of her humiliation. This time, however, the whispers carried a different tone entirely, curiosity replacing mockery as merchants and traders began asking who exactly this young woman was who had managed to secure such favorable terms from a family long considered untouchable. 3 weeks after the private dinner at the Hale estate, an invitation arrived at the trading company, addressed personally to Nora, written in Caroline Hale's precise, elegant handwriting. The envelope sat unopened on her desk for nearly an hour, before she finally broke the wax seal, half expecting some final act of resistance from a family she knew was not accustomed to losing control so completely. Instead, the letter contained an invitation to a charity gathering hosted by the Hale family at the county assembly hall, the very same kind of event where she had once stood humiliated on a staircase, while an entire room laughed at her expense. Attached to the invitation was a short note in Victor's handwriting. "As agreed, we intend to honor our commitment during this gathering. Your presence would ensure the moment carries the weight it deserves." Nora read the note twice, weighing the significance of what was being asked of her. Returning to that world, even under vastly different circumstances, meant facing every familiar face that had once dismissed her so easily. It meant standing again beneath the same chandeliers, surrounded by the same whispered judgments, though this time she would not be arriving as an outsider hoping to be accepted. She would be arriving as someone they could no longer afford to ignore. She brought the letter to Daniel's office that afternoon, setting it on his desk without a word. He read it carefully, before looking up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Are you prepared for this?" he asked. "I have been preparing for this my entire life," Nora replied. "I simply did not know it until recently." The night of the gathering arrived with a cold, clear sky stretching endlessly above the county assembly hall, its windows glowing with warm light that spilled out onto the gravel drive, where carriages arrived in a steady stream. Nora stepped down from Daniel's carriage with the same steady composure she had carried into the Hale dining room weeks earlier, though tonight, far more eyes would be watching. Inside, the hall buzzed with familiar conversation. The same social circle that had witnessed her humiliation now gathered once again beneath glittering chandeliers. She recognized faces immediately: the banker's daughter, the mayor's son, the women from the charity board who had once whispered behind polite smiles. This time, however, their expressions shifted the moment they noticed her, confusion and curiosity replacing the casual dismissal she remembered so clearly from before. She recognized the small orchestra tuning their instruments near the far wall, the same arrangement of chairs along the perimeter of the room, even the same faint scent of polished wood and fresh flowers that had greeted her the night of her humiliation years before. For a brief moment, standing beneath those familiar chandeliers once again, the old fear threatened to rise in her chest, the memory of trembling hands and hot cheeks pressing insistently at the edges of her composure. She breathed through it steadily, reminding herself silently of everything she had built in the years between that night and this one. She was not the same frightened girl who had once fled down these very steps. She belonged in this room now, not because anyone had granted her permission, but because she had earned her place through work no one could dismiss. Victor Hale approached almost immediately, offering a formal, respectful greeting that drew several curious glances from nearby guests. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I know this was not an easy decision." "I did not come for ease," Nora replied. I came because you promised something, and I intend to see it honored. Victor nodded, straightening slightly as he turned toward the center of the room, raising his voice enough to draw the attention of the gathered guests. The hall gradually quieted, curious faces turning toward the county's most prominent family as conversations trailed off into expectant silence. Friends, Victor began, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Many of you know that our family has faced significant challenges over the past year. Tonight, I would like to publicly acknowledge the person responsible for helping secure our company's future. A decision made not through inherited privilege, but through remarkable skill, determination, and character. He gestured toward Nora, who stood quietly near the edge of the gathered crowd, feeling every eye in the room shift toward her once again, though this time the weight behind their attention felt entirely different. Nora Bennett has spent the past year building a career in trade and agricultural business that many in this room, myself included, once believed impossible for someone of her background. Victor continued. I was wrong to ever hold such assumptions, and I believe several others in this room owe her the same acknowledgement. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces showing genuine surprise, others clearly uncomfortable with the direction the evening had taken. Nora kept her expression calm, refusing to let the weight of so many watching eyes shake her composure. Edmund stood near his mother, his jaw tight, clearly having anticipated this moment but finding it no easier to endure now that it had arrived. Victor turned toward his son with a firm, expectant expression. Edmund hesitated only briefly before stepping forward, addressing Nora directly in front of the entire gathered assembly. I owe you a public apology, he said, his voice noticeably strained. The comments I made about you at our previous gathering were cruel and unfounded. I judged you based on assumptions that had nothing to do with your true character or abilities, and I regret the pain that caused you. The room remained utterly silent, every guest absorbing the significance of what they were witnessing. Nora studied Edmund carefully, searching once more for genuine sincerity behind his carefully chosen words. Thank you for saying so, she replied evenly, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet hall. I hope this moment serves as a reminder to everyone here that a person's worth is never determined by their birth or their bank account, but by the character they choose to build through their own actions. A few guests began to nod slowly, murmurs of quiet agreement spreading through portions of the crowd. The banker's daughter, who had once laughed alongside Edmund without hesitation, approached Nora hesitantly after the formal moment had passed. I owe you an apology as well, she said quietly. I was cruel that night, simply because it seemed easier to follow the crowd than to stand apart from it. Nora studied her for a long moment before nodding. Thank you for recognizing that. It takes more courage to admit fault than most people realize. The mayor's son approached soon after, considerably more sheepish than he had ever appeared during their school years together. I owe you an apology as well, he said, shifting uncomfortably. The mud on your boots, all those years ago. I told myself it was harmless fun at the time, but I understand now how much cruelty can hide inside something that seems small to the person causing it. Apologies delivered honestly are never wasted, Nora replied. I hope you carry the lesson forward, not simply toward me, but toward anyone else you might be tempted to treat carelessly. He nodded, clearly humbled, before excusing himself to rejoin the crowd. One of the women from the charity board approached next, her expression carrying genuine warmth rather than the practiced politeness Nora remembered from years of quiet exclusion. I always admired your mother's quiet strength, the woman admitted. I regret that I never had the courage to say so publicly before tonight. Please extend my respects to her. I will, Nora said, touched by the sincerity in the woman's voice. She will appreciate hearing that more than you know. Throughout the remainder of the evening, Nora found herself approached by several guests who had once dismissed her entirely, some offering genuine apologies, others simply engaging her in conversation, with a respect they had never previously extended. She accepted each interaction with careful grace, neither seeking validation from people who had once hurt her deeply, nor rejecting the possibility of genuine change. Caroline Hale remained distant throughout much of the evening, her pride clearly still wounded by the public nature of her family's admission. Near the end of the gathering, however, she approached Nora directly, her expression carefully composed, despite the obvious difficulty of the moment. I will not pretend this has been easy for me to accept, Caroline said stiffly. But I recognize the position my family now holds because of decisions you made with far more integrity than I likely would have shown in your circumstances. I appreciate your honesty, Nora replied. That is more than I expected, and it is enough. As the evening drew to a close, Nora stood near the tall windows overlooking the county she had grown up in, watching the same guests who had once laughed at her humiliation, now speaking quietly among themselves, many casting thoughtful glances in her direction rather than dismissive ones. Daniel joined her near the window, offering a warm smile. "How does it feel?" he asked, "to finally stand in this room as an equal?" Nora considered the question carefully before answering. "It feels less important than I once imagined it would," she admitted. "I spent so long believing their approval was the thing I needed most. Now I realize the only approval that ever truly mattered was my own." Daniel studied her with quiet admiration. "That, I believe, is the most important lesson anyone in this room could learn tonight." As they finally departed the assembly hall, stepping out into the cool night air beneath a sky full of stars, Nora allowed herself a genuine, unguarded smile, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The humiliation she had once endured on a similar night, beneath similar chandeliers, felt like a distant memory now, replaced entirely by the quiet, steady satisfaction of a battle fought with patience, skill, and unwavering integrity, rather than cruelty or spite. She had not destroyed the Hale family, though she certainly could have. She had chosen instead to build something far more lasting, proving beyond any doubt that true strength required no cruelty at all, only the patience to let genuine character speak for itself. Spring arrived early that year, warming the fields around the Bennett farm long before the frost had fully released its grip on the surrounding county. Nora stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the sun rise over land she had known her entire life, feeling a sense of peace that had taken years to build and nearly as long to fully understand. Much had changed since the night of the public gathering at the assembly hall. Her position within Daniel's trading company had continued to grow, her responsibilities expanding well beyond the agricultural division that had first given her a chance to prove herself. She now sat among the company's senior leadership, her voice carrying weight in decisions that shaped trade routes across several counties. The partnership with the Hale Shipping Company had stabilized considerably over the following months, Victor Hale proving himself, gradually, to be a more capable businessman once freed from the constant pressure of hiding his company's struggles. He met with Nora regularly to discuss ongoing arrangements, their professional relationship settling into something resembling genuine mutual respect, built entirely on the foundation of honest work rather than inherited privilege. Edmund, surprisingly, had also begun to change in the months following his public apology. He took a more active role in his family's company, working alongside his father to understand the business responsibilities he had previously ignored in favor of social pursuits. Nora encountered him occasionally during business meetings, and while their history remained complicated, she recognized genuine effort in his changed demeanor, a quiet humility that had not existed in him before that difficult night. "I still think about what I said to you," he admitted during one such meeting, catching her alone briefly after a discussion regarding shipping schedules. "I do not think I will ever fully forgive myself for it." "Growth matters more than guilt," Nora replied simply. "Use what you learn to treat others better than you once treated me. That is the only apology that truly matters." Beyond her dealings with the Hale family, Nora's standing within the wider county had shifted considerably as well. She was invited to sit on the board of the same charity that had once hosted the gala where she was humiliated, a position she accepted not out of any desire for social validation, but because it allowed her to direct real resources toward struggling farming families across the region, families who reminded her constantly of where she had come from and what true hardship looked like beneath the polished surface of county society. She established a small fund through the trading company, specifically to help young farmers access fair loans for equipment and seed, cutting through the predatory lending practices that had trapped families like her own in cycles of debt for generations. Within its first year, the fund helped a dozen families stabilize their farms, each success quietly reinforcing her belief that lasting change came not from a single dramatic victory, but from steady, patient investment in the people too often overlooked by those who held power. Her mother, Grace, took particular pride in this work, often accompanying Nora on visits to nearby farms to meet the families benefiting from the fund. "You have not forgotten where you came from," Grace told her during one such visit, watching Nora patiently explain loan terms to a nervous young farmer, barely older than she had been when Edmund first mocked her. "That is the thing I am proudest of, more than any business success." "I could never forget," Nora replied. "Everything I built started right here, in soil just like this." One family in particular stayed with her long after their initial meeting. A widow named Eleanor Marsh had come to the fund's small office in town with 3 young children in tow, her husband having died the previous winter after a long illness that had drained the family's savings entirely. She stood nervously in the doorway, clearly expecting to be turned away the way she had been at every bank in the county. "I do not have collateral," Eleanor admitted immediately, her voice tight with barely contained shame. "I have only the farm itself, and it is mortgaged already past its worth." Nora recognized the posture instantly, the same defensive tension she herself had once carried into rooms where she expected judgment before she had even spoken. She pulled out a chair for the woman instead of remaining behind her desk. "Sit down," Nora said gently. "Tell me about your farm, not the debts, the land itself, what grows well there, what your husband built before he passed." Eleanor blinked, clearly unprepared for the question, but slowly began describing the small orchard her husband had planted years earlier, apple trees that were only now beginning to bear a proper harvest, and a modest herd of dairy cattle that had kept the family fed through the hardest winters. By the end of the conversation, Nora had structured a loan unlike anything the county's banks would have considered, tied not to rigid collateral but to a share of the coming apple harvest, generous enough to give the family breathing room, structured carefully enough to protect the fund's resources for other families in need. "Why would you take this risk on me?" Eleanor asked quietly as she prepared to leave, tears gathering in her eyes. "Because someone once looked past what I did not have and saw what I was capable of building instead," Nora replied. "I intend to keep passing that forward for as long as I am able." Eleanor's orchard flourished within 2 seasons, the loan repaid in full, a full year ahead of schedule. She returned occasionally afterward, not for further assistance, but simply to share news of her children's progress, and to thank Nora once more for a kindness she said had changed the entire trajectory of her family's future. Stories like Eleanor's multiplied slowly across the county over the following years, each one reinforcing the same lesson Nora had carried with her since that humiliating night on the ballroom staircase. True change rarely arrived through single dramatic gestures. It arrived through patient, consistent effort, applied steadily over time until an entire community began to shift beneath the weight of accumulated good work. Her relationship with Daniel, meanwhile, had grown into something far deeper than the professional partnership it had begun as. Over the months of working closely together, building the company's success through countless late nights and shared challenges, something quiet and steady had grown between them, unhurried but undeniable. He proposed to her on a warm evening in early spring, not in some grand ballroom filled with glittering chandeliers, but at the edge of the very pasture where she now stood, beneath a sky full of stars remarkably similar to the ones she had watched on the long carriage ride home after her humiliation years before. "I love you not despite where you came from," he had told her, "but because of the strength that place gave you. I cannot imagine building a future with anyone else." Nora had said yes without hesitation, understanding fully, for the first time, that true partnership required no pretense, no hidden judgment, only honest respect built between two people who valued each other's genuine character above everything else. They sat together afterward on the low stone wall bordering the pasture, watching the last light fade over the fields while the pigs settled noisily into their pens for the night. Daniel laughed softly at the sound, shaking his head with genuine affection. "I proposed to you beside a pig pen," he said. "I do not think my mother would quite understand the romance of it." "She does not need to understand it," Nora replied, smiling. "It is exactly right for us. Everything I am, everything I built, started in a place just like this. I would not want to begin our life together anywhere else." He took her hand, turning it over gently to study the calluses still visible along her palm despite years spent behind a desk. "I love these hands," he said quietly. "They tell the truth about who you are, no matter how much silk or fine paper surrounds you during the day." Her parents had wept with joy at the news, her mother embracing her tightly while her father, a man of few words, simply squeezed her shoulder with quiet, unmistakable pride. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," Walter told her that evening, his voice thick with emotion. "You built something real, Nora, something no one can ever take away from you." "I learned that from watching you and Mother," Nora replied. "You built this farm from nothing, and you never let anyone's judgment stop you. I simply followed the example you set." As she stood now at the edge of the pasture, watching the sun rise fully over the fields, she thought back over the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation of that first ballroom gala felt like a distant memory now, softened by time and by everything she had built in the years since. She had not needed cruelty to achieve her victory. She had needed only patience, skill, and an unwavering belief in her own worth, qualities that had been present within her long before Daniel Pierce ever offered her a chance to prove them to the world. The pigs shifted and grunted in their pens nearby, the familiar sounds of the farm grounding her firmly in the life she had never truly left behind, despite everything she had achieved beyond its borders. She smiled, thinking of how far she had traveled since that humiliating night, and how completely unnecessary it had been for her to travel far at all, in order to become exactly who she was always meant to be. Nora Bennett had never needed the aristocracy's approval to know her own worth. She had simply needed the world to finally see it clearly. And now, standing in the golden light of an early spring morning, surrounded by the land that had shaped her, the family that had raised her, and the future she had built entirely through her own determination, she understood completely that the greatest revenge had never truly been about the Hales at all. It had been about proving, beyond any doubt, exactly who she had always been. 2 years later, the wedding took place not in the grand assembly hall where so much of her story had unfolded, but in the open field beside the Bennett farmhouse, beneath a canopy of early summer flowers her mother had spent weeks growing especially for the occasion. Nora stood beneath the wooden arch her father had built with his own hands, dressed in a gown far simpler than anything the county's aristocracy would have considered fashionable, yet more beautiful to her than anything she had ever worn. Daniel waited for her at the end of the grass-covered aisle, his expression full of quiet joy as she approached. The guest list reflected the full journey of her life, rather than any single chapter of it. Farmers from neighboring properties sat alongside colleagues from the trading company. Margaret, now a close friend rather than a skeptical co-worker, sat near the front with tears in her eyes. Even Victor Hale attended, seated respectfully among the guests, his presence a quiet testament to how completely the balance between their families had shifted over the years. Edmund did not attend the wedding itself, though he sent a brief, sincere letter congratulating her on her marriage, expressing genuine hope that her future would bring her the happiness she deserved. Nora read the letter with quiet satisfaction, recognizing in its simple honesty the slow, steady growth of a man who had once believed cruelty carried no consequence. Caroline sent flowers, an unexpected gesture that spoke louder than any words could have managed, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of respect finally earned rather than freely given. The ceremony itself was simple, filled with laughter rather than the rigid formality of the events that had once defined so much of Nora's early struggles. Her father walked her down the aisle with visible pride, whispering quietly that her grandfather would have been overjoyed to witness this exact moment. Following the ceremony, the celebration continued late into the evening, the farmhouse and surrounding fields filled with warm laughter, simple food, and genuine joy that no amount of aristocratic wealth could ever fully replicate. Long tables had been set up beneath strings of hanging lanterns, laden with dishes prepared by neighboring families who had known Nora since childhood, simple hearty food that carried far more meaning than the elaborate courses served at the grand galas of her youth. Grace danced with Walter beneath the lantern light, both of them laughing like young sweethearts rather than parents who had spent decades working the land together. Margaret raised a toast to Nora's future, her voice thick with emotion as she recalled the skeptical woman she had once been, and how completely Nora had proven her wrong in every possible way. Even Harold, usually so reserved, offered a heartfelt speech about watching a farmer's daughter transform an entire division of the company through nothing but persistence and sharp thinking. Late in the evening, as the music slowed and the youngest guests began drifting toward sleep in their parents' arms, Nora found a quiet moment alone with her father near the edge of the celebration. "I am proud of you," Walter said simply, watching the warm chaos of the gathering before them. "Not because of the company you built or the wealth you have earned. I am proud because you never once let anyone convince you that you were less than you knew yourself to be." "I learned that from you and Mother," Nora replied. "Every single day you worked this land without complaint, without ever once believing you owed anyone an apology for who you were." In the years that followed, Nora's influence within the trading company continued to grow, eventually leading the entire organization alongside Daniel, as true equal partners in both business and life. Their success extended well beyond the county, their reputation for fair, honest dealings earning them respect across the wider region, built entirely on the foundation of hard work and integrity rather than inherited privilege. The Bennett farm itself flourished under continued careful management, eventually expanding under the guidance of Nora's younger cousins, who took over daily operations while proudly maintaining the values and traditions that had shaped the family for generations. Nora visited often, never losing touch with the land and the life that had built the foundation of everything she eventually achieved. The Hale family's fortunes, meanwhile, continued their slow, steady recovery under Victor's more careful management, aided consistently by the partnership Nora had built. Edmund eventually took over much of the daily operations himself, having spent years earning the kind of practical experience he had once avoided entirely in favor of social pursuits. He married a woman from a modest merchant family several years later, a decision that caused a quiet stir among the county's older aristocracy, but one that Edmund defended without hesitation, having learned firsthand the emptiness of judging character by birth alone. He and Nora crossed paths occasionally at business gatherings over the following years, their interactions marked by a respectful distance that had replaced the old animosity entirely. Neither sought the other out, but neither avoided the other either. Their history settled into something resembling peaceful acknowledgement rather than lingering resentment. Caroline never fully softened, maintaining a careful reserve whenever her path crossed with Nora's, though even she could not deny, in her more honest moments, the respect Nora's steady rise had ultimately earned. Some wounds to pride healed slowly, if they healed at all, but even Caroline's silence eventually carried less hostility than it once had, worn down gradually by years of watching Nora conduct herself with unwavering integrity. Years later, when a new generation of children ran through those same familiar fields, Nora would sometimes tell them the story of a girl who had once been mocked for smelling of the barn and wearing homemade dresses to a grand ballroom gala, a girl who had refused to let cruelty define her, choosing instead to build something lasting through patience, skill, and unwavering belief in her own worth. Nora and Daniel welcomed 2 children of their own in the years following their marriage, a daughter named Elsie who inherited her mother's sharp, observant eyes, and a son named Peter who showed an early fascination with the farm animals whenever the family visited Grace and Walter. Nora made certain both children spent as much time among the fields and pens as they did within the offices of the trading company, determined that they would grow up understanding the value of honest work regardless of the comfort their family's success now afforded them. Money can disappear in a single bad season, she often reminded them, echoing words her own mother had once spoken to her. What you build with your own hands and your own character, no one can ever take away. Elsie, in particular, showed an early talent for numbers and negotiation, often trailing after her mother during visits to the trading company, absorbing lessons about fairness and patience that would shape her own approach to business years later. Peter preferred the quiet rhythm of the farm, eventually choosing to work alongside his cousins tending the land that had shaped 3 generations of the Bennett family before him. The farm itself remained a constant thread running through every chapter of Nora's expanding life, a reminder that no amount of success in the wider world ever diminished the value of the roots that had made such success possible in the first place. She returned often, sometimes simply to sit quietly on the old stone wall where Daniel had once proposed, watching the sun set over fields that had witnessed every stage of her transformation. "Did you ever get your revenge?" one of the younger children asked her once, wide-eyed with curiosity after hearing the story for the first time. Nora considered the question thoughtfully before answering with a warm, knowing smile. "I did not seek revenge," she told them gently. "I sought proof. Proof that where you come from never determines where you are capable of going, so long as you refuse to let anyone else's judgment become the story you tell about yourself." The children listened intently, absorbing a lesson far more valuable than any tale of simple triumph over cruelty, a lesson about patience, integrity, and the quiet, steady power of building something real, one determined step at a time. And somewhere in the distance, the familiar sounds of the farm continued exactly as they always had, grounding every success Nora Bennett would ever achieve firmly in the honest, hard-working roots that had shaped her from the very beginning.